Thank you so much, John, and thank you to everyone joining from around the world. It's an absolute pleasure to join you from the lovely Airlink and Embraer Training Center in Johannesburg, South Africa. And we also just want to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Joel Randriamantro, the Minister of Tourism, Transport and Meteorology for the Republic of Madagascar. Thank you so much for hosting this lovely event. So in this session today, we're briefly going to discuss a couple of matters around the state of African aviation. And of course, depending on how one looks at it or the different areas that you might be focusing on your business, different elements may be more important versus others. So we've tried to really give a high level view of the industry, looking at slightly different angles. And I think what's quite important that we'd like to highlight up front is that aviation really is an ecosystem. And what is important is in a period of difficulties such as this one, in the future world that we're trying to define for ourselves, where recovery is important, we must look at the ecosystem effect that aviation has, particularly in the African sense. So we'll briefly look at a macroeconomic view across Africa. We'll touch on the aviation ecosystem. We'll get into some numbers from a current market state perspective, and then we'll look at lessons learned and driving the way forward. So we hope you enjoy the session, and please feel free to ask questions. We'll respond to them accordingly. So we always like to start with a macroeconomic view of the world around us, given the fact that aviation, of course, is a significant economic activity that has many tentacles around other economic activities as well. So the outlook for Africa has actually been quite mixed across different countries. However, as a region, the effects of COVID-19 actually saw in 2020 that our real GDP growth was negative 1.93%. Some recovery is expected this year, and analysts and forecasts right now across the different entities are agreeing at around 3.41% real GDP growth rate compared to last year. What we do know, of course, is that Africa as a whole had recent periods of decent growth across the region, above 3% year on year. And this actually buffered us going into the pandemic simply because it was off the back of decent growth for the last few years. And of course, this is nuanced across different countries. The expectation is that by 2026, the sub-Saharan African GDP growth rate is expected to rise to 4%, with several countries' economies actually showing 5% real GDP growth rates year on year. Of course, larger economies such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Angola experienced deeper contractions within the short term, but of course, those expectations are expected to be more positive as the years go by and we recover as a region. Of course, from a SADC perspective, where I am based, heavily weighted by South Africa's performance, our GDP for last year as SADC was negative 4.92%. But again, there is a strong expectation that this will recover. Probably one point to mention, if you look at the graph on the right, which is the latest IMF data, is that we, from a GDP growth rate perspective, we fared better than the world averages simply because of the periods of growth that Africa as a whole was going through. And we wanted to give some insight into what does this mean when you talk about GDP or changes from an economic perspective? And there are several and non-exhaustive lists of socioeconomic dynamics that have been identified as a result of COVID-19 based on various economic responses across the region. But one thing that's been clear is that, particularly from an African perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a surge in government financing needs in Africa. If you look at fiscal stimulus packages, according to the African Development Bank, this ranged from about 0.02% of GDP spend in South Sudan to about 10.4% of GDP here in South Africa. And it's estimated that to really get over the short-term recovery requirements, or to rather finance the short-term recovery requirements, an estimated $154 billion is required by African states collectively. One important element to consider is that debt resolution in Africa has often been disorderly and protracted, which of course has costly economic consequences, both from a private and official creditor perspective. And of course, being in aviation, we know that risk really is a measure that a lot of industry participants are looking at with the lens of supporting African aviation. Perhaps one point that we can all kind of understand really from an aviation perspective, looking at the economic picture, is that there's a significant presence of state-owned entities within African states. And several of these are arguably underperforming, which actually puts pressure on sovereign fisci. And what this simply means is that governments who are going through challenging periods and having to finance different parts of the economy are having to make tough trade-off decisions to support aviation. And this goes beyond the sector. It is looked at supporting aviation versus supporting other sectors. So that's quite an important one that I'm sure a lot of our stakeholders can attest to, especially state-owned carriers. Perhaps more maybe qualitative features, more from a social perspective with regards to some of the economic happenings with COVID, is that it's been clear that the digital divide has actually worsened in certain areas. So countries that may have had poor energy electrification rates, limited urbanization or mobile access have struggled to transition businesses into this virtual new normal. With this said, however, it's quite clear that fintech is a very important sector that we must pay attention to, simply because Africa has leapfrogged certain technological milestones, especially if you talk from fixed line to mobile data penetration. And this has direct bearing on aviation. There's some innovation across the region where airlines are utilizing fintech platforms, from a payments to customer management, customer relations management perspective through these technologies. And the mobile penetration really drives this forward. And we've seen some interesting innovation across industries and within aviation in the last year. And as we talk about digital transformation throughout the next few days, I think it's clear that in many ways, in some countries, COVID-19 has actually been an accelerant for certain digital transformation initiatives across industries and across businesses. Of course, there has been a labor market divide, simply meaning that those who are skilled were probably more able to keep their jobs or pivot, whilst workers that were semi or low skilled may have struggled, especially those in the informal sector who lost jobs and lost revenue opportunities simply because of lockdown restrictions and the inability to move around. And of course, what is very clear is that there are clear healthcare capacity divides across the region, which of course has bearing on the overall quality of life. Looking briefly at the aviation ecosystem, this is actually a reflection point for us as an industry. And we wanted to just position this and to note that, we are a result of everyone else's efforts. I know a lot of attention is spent on airlines and airports being more tangible pieces of the industry, but this is really what the ecosystem looks like. And what has been clear is that initial evidence is showing that recovery will be bolstered where there is a strong domestic aviation system, even where structural flaws exist. And you can see that in some of the domestic data, where the really strong, mature markets and strong ecosystems, recovery seems to be on the increase, and hopefully it'll shorten that period. But just to reflect this point, which many of us are familiar with, I think this specific graphic is from Embraer. We know that the aviation sector is quite diverse. There are direct, indirect, and catalytic effects of the industry based on the different providers. So of course, the more visible are airline, airport services, air navigation, what happens in the civil aerospace manufacturing space as well. From an indirect perspective, we have a whole range of suppliers and manufacturers, business services that support our industry. And of course, there's an induced effect on other mini sectors, one can say, in terms of hospitality, food and beverage, etc. And of course, from a catalytic effect perspective, we know very well that aviation and transport has a direct bearing on trade, tourism, investment confidence, and other broader economic matrices as well. And with regards to this ecosystem, if you can just have a brief discussion, we are aware, and of course we are part of documenting the story of airlines and airports, but we must not lose sight of the potential impact on other parts of the ecosystem. And there are two that we would like to highlight. From an MRO perspective, I think the importance of MROs has actually come out quite a bit in the last year, particularly from a loss of technical expertise perspective, underutilized infrastructure and capacity, where because of what is happening from a demand perspective due to COVID impacting on airlines activity, MROs are being challenged across the region. And this is such an important sector that we must not lose sight of. So to our stakeholders in both public and private sector, we need to ensure that the entirety of the system is supported. And perhaps a more qualitative feature, but one that we would like to highlight, is that of human capital. There have been rolling forecasts on the expectation of job losses in the region. And this not only has an impact on everyone who's lost work, but it does have an impact on vulnerable sectors. And we know very well that in Africa, youth and women comprise of those sectors. So again, let us not lose sight of the human capital element with regards to what is happening in the aviation ecosystem and protecting vulnerable communities that need support. Our expectation is that we do expect increased merger and acquisition activity, both at a horizontal level and a vertical level, simply because COVID has really almost created a clean slate in many respects, where certain discussions that had not happened before are happening. And we must just be aware of that. We have coined this as sustainability through consolidation, where in order for some businesses to drive the way forward and actually operate on a better and stronger footing rather, there might be sustainability achieved through consolidation, through M&A activity. We've noted some of the reports from South African aviation perspective across both private and public sector airlines. In Kenya, the significant changes at a national level in terms of legislation to support the aviation ecosystem. And Burkina Faso, although smaller in magnitude from an aviation perspective, their government recently diluted their interest in a part privatization to a private investment group. As we jump into the numbers and looking at the current state, we split this from a supply side and a demand side perspective. I think from a supply side perspective, we're quite familiar with the numbers. As you can see, this is analysis from 2018 to 2021. Note 2021 includes half-year figures, so January to June, but it really talks to the aviation majors in the region that are responsible for most supply. Of course, we know Ethiopian Airlines is the largest airline from that perspective. SAA has gone through their own changes in the last years, and their share has significantly reduced. Egypt Air is still quite significant from a capacity perspective, as well as other national carriers across the region. And of course, from a Southern Africa perspective, there are a few entities that are quite strong from a seat capacity perspective. And I think SAFA is one to mention just in terms of their significant growth over the years. And as it stands, SAFA is the largest single airline within South Africa. But a note on supply, and my airline colleagues will, perhaps look at me with side eyes, but what an airline publishes and what they operate is quite different. And those differences appear to be on the increase. And this is simply because airlines are operating in very volatile environments with exogenous factors out of their control, of course, such as lockdown restrictions. But a published schedule and a long in advance published schedule can also be a sign of market confidence and signaling an airline's optimism for a certain market. So we must just look at that contextually in terms of operated versus published capacity. We're going to spend a few minutes on the demand side here. And in this respect, this is just a simple chronology of what has happened over the last period. So from a timeline perspective, what we looked at was from March last year to March this year, 13 months of data from a demand side perspective. And as we know, when March hit, on the 11th of March, that's when the World Health Organization declared this virus as a pandemic. By the end of March, we saw a significant amount of lockdown restrictions imposed not just in Africa, but other parts of the world. And this directly impacted demand. In June, July, there was the restart of domestic travel in countries where they had locked down the domestic sectors. Ghana was actually the first African country and the second in the world after Vietnam to open up their domestic airspace after lockdown in 2020. August to October saw the easing of international and regional travel restrictions. So we saw some uptake there from demand perspective entering into the typical peak period. But unfortunately, toward the end of the year last year, we started seeing COVID-19 waves, as well as new variants being introduced. And here in South Africa, we went straight into lockdown. And what's quite important, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is that this data represents all of the regions to and from Africa. And the top 4 regions were actually intra-regional flows. And that's an important element that we would like for you to keep in your minds as we continue the discussion. So to get into a little bit more detail, and also our point about where you have a strong domestic or regional market, recovery will be better. And this is an even better opportunity for all regional and local stakeholders to, quote unquote, get their houses in order and address some structural issues. But from a demand perspective, Southern Africa actually showed the strongest aggregate demand. And as you've mentioned, FlySafe Air was quite significant in this period due to their growth. North Africa to Western Europe and Middle East, respectively, were actually the largest intercontinental flows. So these would come after the top 4, which are all intra-regional, and then the next regions were actually intercontinental. And this is expected given North African aviation's catchment area, which is very close linked to Europe, and of course the Middle East due to cultural and political ties. And looking at external factors such as lockdown restrictions, we have noted that for the most part, the continent has applied similar measures through the pandemic period. This also talks to our regional structures around the groupings such as SADC, ECOWAS, the East Africa Community, which provides for macroeconomic cooperation. But we must also highlight that with this said, there are differences in travel protocols, and these are quite varied across the region. Looking a little bit briefer from a demand side perspective, looking at all of the regions which are mapped out on the right, if you just compare March 2020 to March 2021, it isn't a positive picture of 47% decline in passenger traffic. However, Q1 of this year, we closed at 8.7 million passengers, which is not where we were, but it's definitely a point in the right direction. What is interesting to note at a more granular level is that the largest proportionate variances from a demand perspective were between African regions and Western Europe. And this isn't surprising given the strict lockdown measures that were applied by several EU countries as well as the UK. And only one region in this regard actually showed growth in this period, which was flows between North Africa and East and Central Europe. Overall, we're quite encouraged by this data simply because it shows the importance of regional strength. So again, we would like to highlight that as regional stakeholders, BU, airline, airport, political, financial, there is a lot of attraction in organizing ourselves around the regional structures that are there and exist in the continent. And our last section as we close off is briefly on lessons learned, which is around customer experience, internal process, and cooperation. What's important to mention from a customer experience perspective is that entities and the ecosystem need to have a behavior understanding of customers and thereby position themselves in their approaches. An element of this is also about education on health and safety. And we've seen a lot of examples. A brief shout out to Rwanda Air for being rated the safest airline in Africa, simply by inoculating all of their staff, which is a really great achievement. On the internal process perspective, we note that it's important to not ignore historical data. The baseline still has value. However, we need to layer this with new elements, such as vaccine rollout, travel restriction heat maps, second, third wave elements, etc. Right across the board is absolutely critical. I think Embraer have coined this term, but the whole industry is using it right now, where we need to ensure that the capacity we deploy is in line with the market expectation, and fleet talks to that as well. And of course, just the whole notion of flexible risk management within African aviation business planning is quite important. And the last step, before I hand over to John, is that about cooperation. I think this very example of this session is an example of cooperation, but cooperation within and across the industry will remain important. Thank you to all the bodies that have been pushing cooperative efforts on industry matters and going beyond the industry, working with health authorities. We need to increase this work. As we close, we want to leave you with 2 points. Number one, this is a quote from the 1930s by the world famous economist John Maynard Keynes, which actually has relevance today. Markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. Although we have cautious optimism, we must have a balanced approach between experimentation as well as risk. And secondly, which we've just emphasized, cooperation remains necessary for the aviation ecosystem to recover and thrive. So with that said, I would like to encourage everyone to continue to innovate, unite, and thrive, and all the best for the next 2 days of discussions. Thank you so much, and over to you, John.